What has not changed is the fact that American students, by and large, come into a theology class, especially, with all sorts of preconceived ideas about what is religion, et cetera. Theology is a word they don't really know what to do with. They all know what religion is, and they all have a very strikingly similar understanding of what religion is, which I have to spend the first third of the semester disabusing them of if I'm going to be able to even do anything, like introduce them to Catholicism at all.
Welcome back to the Space Alvey Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
Good, Andrew. School has begun, so just busy with classes.
Yes, the academic year is upon us again. In North America, we are after Labor Day. I don't know, do they have Labor Day in Poland, Bobby?
I don't think it, no, I don't think they do.
Okay.
Yeah, nothing like it.
But they have a lot more leisure built into their culture, so it's not such a big deal like it is for us in America. But anyway, the time of year is important to us, thinking about the start of a new school year, academic year, because we are talking with a friend of ours, Rodney Howsare, who is a professor. In fact, he is a professor of theology at DeSales University, where he's been for 25 years. And that detail is important because we're going to talk to Rodney specifically about what he sees among his students. We're going to talk about an article that he wrote for Catholic World Report recently called Secularism and Catholic Higher Education in America, among other things, perhaps. But Rodney, welcome back. How are you?
Doing very well. Glad to be back.
Yeah, it's been a while, and we really, really enjoyed talking to you the last time. And so we're delighted that we have a chance to talk to you again today. We're going to get into the depths, I would imagine, about secularism, which is such an important topic. But let's start kind of on the ground, which is where you begin in this really excellent article that you wrote for Catholic World Report. You have been a professor at a Catholic university for a long time. What do you see among your students in terms of their sense of religiosity and how they interact with the secular culture?
Yeah, the thing that I think is striking out of the gate, and this really hasn't changed much. I mean, I've now taught probably two generations, and I'm guessing broadly millennials and Gen Z. I think that's probably, I might have caught the tail end of Gen X, possibly, but basically Gen X to millennial, and then now Gen Z. I think that's where we are. And there's definitely a difference in terms of these questions. What has not changed is the fact that American students, by and large, come into a theology class, especially, with all sorts of preconceived ideas about what is religion, et cetera. Theology is a word they don't really know what to do with. They all know what religion is, and they all have a very strikingly similar understanding of what religion is, which I have to spend the first third of the semester disabusing them of if I'm going to be able to even do anything, like introduce them to Catholicism at all. I find.
You mean like you just engage them, like ask them questions about what they believe, for example, or how do you do that?
Yes, I mean, I begin by kind of getting them to say, what is religion, and it really does just kind of come out of the gate of a very, what I call a Lockean understanding that religion is a private matter. It's about beliefs about supernatural things. They might not use the word supernatural, otherworldly. I say things that go bump in the night, things like that. They also are they espouse a religious relativism that just rolls off the tongue. They don't think about it. They don't think that it just goes without saying that all religions are basically the same. And it doesn't really make a difference which one you have, or if you have none, as long as you're a good person, that's what really matters. Those kind of platitudes are so deeply ingrained in them that it's very hard to get them to even look objectively at like the actual history of religion,
Hmm.
which I find is a very effective tool I start every intro to Catholic theology course with an overview of the history of religion.
Fascinating. In your article, you get into the details on what Thomas Aquinas and Augustine mean by religio. And it's
Yeah.
so helpful because you say that it's under, the virtue of justice and
Yeah.
being, having gratitude to the source of all things.
Yes.
And, today I have to admit, I delighted in showing a Terrence Malick, like short little piece to some young students. I think I put them to sleep, but I showed them this little documentary called The Voyage of Time. And the reason I like it so much is that it gives you this kind of and this is for a history class, but it gives you a panoramic view, like cosmic history, all the way from kind of the Big Bang to human beings. And everything in some ways is tending to the good. You have these little voiceovers of Brad Pitt, like moving to the light or
Yeah. Yeah.
the good. But there's this kind of almost natural religiosity to the whole thing that,
Yeah.
like, I always find it as a good way to kind of prepare my students when we're thinking about human beings and like human history as that being at the core of it. But could you maybe like explain a little bit about like what do these thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and Augustine mean by religio? And
Yeah.
maybe we can go even further a little bit later and say, well, what was the change? What changed?
Yeah. 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 I mean, so for religious people, let's just say, all right, that would be a good group of people to ask like what religion is instead of having secularized professors from I don't know state universities tell us what. I mean, religion, from the very as early as we can really say anything intelligent about religion, we don't know much about primitive religion. So there's always these caveats and stuff. But as soon as we start to figure out something about the earliest expressions of religion, what we see is that they are a response to reality, to the strangeness of the existence of anything and everything. Seasons, the sun, the moon, the stars, life. Life is a really weird, thing. Death is even weirder, maybe, all of these realities that are just a part of reality give rise to just a sense of like, whoa, this is really odd. This is mysterious. This is not, it doesn't explain itself. I always think of this in the David Bentley Hart's book on God, which is actually really good, by the way. He tells, I think it's Richard Taylor's the philosopher. I may be wrong about that, but tells us, he gives an illustration. He says, imagine you were hiking in the woods one day and you came up on a 30-foot translucent sphere or orb just sitting there, in the woods. And he says, you would obviously be like, whoa, like, what is that? And why is that? How did that get here? And, all that. You would just have this really sense. He goes, but nobody ever pauses to think about the universe that way. And it's at least as odd as a 30-foot translucent orb or what, just the sheer existence of a universe or even of just Earth, because I'm not sure that primitive people knew that, they were situated in this enormous universe or something like that. Right. But either way, I mean, just reality around us. And it's so interesting. Thomas Aquinas doesn't know a lot about the history of religion compared to, say, modern historians of religion and things like that. But he just philosophically gets that religio is born out of a response to the universe's order. I think he calls it an immediate response. The word's kind of important there because it's not a philosophical act. Later on, he's going to do some philosophy to show us that it makes sense to believe in that there's a source to the universe and the contingencies and all that stuff. But religio for Thomas happens prior to that. It's what almost all people, he says. So he's talking about ordinary people when they see the order of the universe. And he's probably talking about the season, the regularity of the seasons, the predictability of these things and those things, that the sun comes up every day, that kind of stuff. Fills them with a sense of just almost like gratitude, like, wow, it's so cool that this happens this way. And and therefore it's kind of interesting. It rids religion of the kind of baggage that the modern person thinks that it has. We first think of it as an obligation, like you better go to church on Sunday. But that's not where it's born for Thomas. It's born as just like, oh, who do I owe thanks for this? To whom do I give my thanks for this? And that's a really that now makes religion relevant to everything.
Yeah, and even people who weren't as brilliant as Thomas Aquinas, it seems like up until a couple of, I don't know, maybe a century or two ago, just had this, they just got that. They had that natural, as you say in the article, and it's natural. Like being religious is natural. And we now live with this bizarre mythology of neutrality, which says basically like, if you want to be religious, well, that's just something you do kind of extra, that's just kind of your thing that helps you make sense of something. But we're all just, we're all just neutral, really. I mean, where does that come from?
Yeah, well, that's so it's funny because in the article I talk about how, secularism, in order to sell itself, it has to tell us a different story about ourselves, right? And it's so kind of sinister. DC Schindler has this, he loves this, Richard Wright, I believe is the comedian, has this really funny joke where he says he got up one morning and came out into his apartment only to find out that every single piece of everything in the apartment had been replaced with identical replicas. And so then he said, and then he goes, and then my roommate came out and I said, have you noticed that everything's been replaced with identical replicas? And his roommate said, do I know you? Right. So the roommate is obviously an identical replica also, but Schindler says that what modernity has done is it's taken all of our words and it's replaced them with identical. They look the same: religion, secular. We still have the same language, freedom, et cetera. But we mean something, in some cases, almost absolutely different by them. And it's such a sleight of hand. I mean, Locke just writes this letter concerning toleration, in the 1600s. And the way he talks about religio there is so different from Thomas Aquinas and Augustine. You're like, where did this come from? And it does have a history. I mean, people have kind of traced it. There's a kind of a genealogy of it, and it does kind of start with Nicholas of Cusa a little bit, because he begins to be more aware of the different worldviews, and he wants to find peace between the different worldviews. And so, I think he might be the first one to use religion in the plural. Up until that time period, there was no such thing as religions in the plural. Muslims would not have thought of Catholics as being a different religion. They would have thought of them as bad Muslims, right? Wonky Muslims or whatever, and vice versa. They're all heretics by the other person's view. And so Locke needs to invent this new understanding of religion, which makes it possible for there to be many religions. He's totally fine with that, right? And they start using the word with regard to Protestant denominations. So that's our first real usage of religions. That's when we really start to use it in earnest. They're all species of a genus, and the genus being religion, and then Methodist, Baptist, Anglicans, you name it, are now species. That he kind of throws that out there. But of course, to keep the peace between these parties, he's got to make it first and foremost about distinct beliefs about supernatural things, which, if you think about it, that is what was dividing. What divides a Lutheran from an Anglican? Well, one has holy orders as a sacrament and the other one doesn't, let's say, right? I mean, these are pretty esoteric and somewhat irrelevant beliefs to everyday life, maybe, right? But it's all of a sudden it becomes really hair-splitting differences about things that don't seem to be very much related to the rest of life. And so that's really the kind of the origin, I think. Yeah.
Just real quick, I know Bobby wants to jump back in, but this just reminded me, Rodney, of something that I actually explore in a book that I just finished. The whole idea of denominations is just kind of hilarious. I mean, I grew up a Protestant and now Catholic, and I discovered along the way that the Catholic Church never uses the word denomination. We don't use it. Right. But it is the kind of de facto language of how to talk about at least Christian religions in the West now. And the only other place where we use the word denomination is with regard to money. And in a sense, right, it all cashes out. It doesn't matter, right? You can have it in 10s or 20s or whatever, but it's all, money is money, right? $100 is $100, whether you have it in pennies or have it in 20s. And that tends to be the way we think about Christian traditions, but then religion more generally, it seems to me.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was astounded. I mean, I didn't really start doing a lot of research on this until I realized when I started teaching at DeSales that my students had this really problematic understanding of religion. And so I just started doing a bunch of research on it and started reading people like Paul Griffiths and William Cavanaugh. And more recently, Brent Nongbre has a really good book called Before Religion. And the things that astounded me were the fact that Westerners went to places like India in the 1800s and told them they were practicing a religion called Hinduism. And they were just kind of like, if you say so, right? I mean, there was no word in the Indian dialects that corresponded to the word religion at all being used that way. There were words for like devotion, piety, words closer actually to religio, as Aquinas uses it, I would say, but nothing that would say there is this genus with a bunch of, denominations within it. And there was a funny story, I think it's in the Nongbre book, where he talks about when the British asked the Indian people to do a census one time, they wanted to get them to divide people according to their religions. And of course, they didn't think this way. It was like so foreign to them that they counted Muslims and Buddhists as Hindus. Mm-hmm. they were like, they had this really strange high percentage of Hindus in India. I mean, it's high anyhow, but it was even higher. And the Brits like, this can't be. What about the Buddhists and the Muslims? And their response was like, aren't they Hindus too? They just didn't get it, because it was a total Protestant way of thinking. Like Buddhists are different from Hindus because of X, Y, and Z beliefs. Kind of like beliefs about the supernatural. And even it went so far as that Protestant scholars of religion sort of preferred Buddhism to Hinduism because Buddhism was more like Protestantism and Hinduism was more like Catholicism. Mm-hmm. So they were viewing the whole thing through this very strange Western problem of denominational diversity, whatever you want to call it, and just totally inflicting that on the rest of the world, which is weird enough. But it is kind of interesting to me to think about it that way, because this is precisely how secularism passes itself off, is just the way things are. Once you get rid of all the particular biases and prejudices and commitments and stuff, then you're just left with the secular. And the Western person, I think, has always seen himself as like, we just kind of think about the world neutrally. Everybody else is in various stages of superstition, and only a matter of time will get them all to swing our way, right? So there's a kind of interesting thing going on there too.
Yeah, Rodney, I mean, that word belief, it's really interesting because you mentioned here that in the modern context, we see religion not necessarily as like a natural thing, but as a voluntaristic thing. But what's interesting is, just with religion being a natural thing, I mean, we think about beliefs in the Christian context because obviously there's the faith component to it, but that word belief is such a tricky word. And I mean, could you maybe expound a little bit on that? Because I think that we get a little bit, we have like things like worldviews and other beliefs, and all this language, like you said, has different meanings to it. And I mean, I'm even a little bit puzzled by the word itself. I mean, we think credo, okay, I believe, Can you say something on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, I mean, one thing to be said that's just kind of interesting right up front is once you have a single personal God, something like faith is going to become enormously important. I don't think that faith is important to Buddhism at all. You know what I mean? Or it's very little, because the Buddha just thinks he's describing the way things are. There's this thing, there's suffering, right? Where does it come from? It comes from inordinate attachments to finite goods, let's say, or something like that. What's the way to get out of it? The excellent eightfold path. You'll detach yourself from things that are fleeting and not real. You'll ascend to to something like nirvana. He's not asking anybody to believe him or follow him or put their faith in him. He's trying to convince them of something that just, if he thinks if they're just reasonable people who are open to reality the way he is, they're going to see that he's right about this. And this is why, like in so many Eastern religions, now I'm going to use the modern terms just for argument's sake. Faith is not really that important. So I think that's something to think about, because what happens in especially Christianity, because we are the recipients of a revelation, of a divine revelation that is something we couldn't know on our own. Now trust becomes really important, because what we're receiving in this revelation is a God's eye perspective on things. We become participants in God's self-knowledge. That's what faith is, right? He's giving it. That's why it's a gift. It's a theological virtue, because without it, we wouldn't know the mind of God. It's above our pay grade. And we wouldn't know particular things about God that only God knows, right? That's what gives the son an advantage, because he knows God from the inside. He can come and say, hey, let me tell you, what God is, what the Father is like, right? Now, in order for us to gain that kind of knowledge, we have to receive this gift of faith, which now takes us above our reason and gives us access to a dimension of reality that we don't have by nature as creatures, as finite creatures, especially as sinful finite creatures. So that's a really interesting thing that distinguishes something like Christianity in a really, really significant way from something like, say, being a Confucianist or a Buddhist or something like that. And just pointing out these kinds of differences to my students help them to see how silly it is to say, well, all religions are basically the same. I'm like, well, one asks for faith, one doesn't. One elevates love to the highest thing, and one certainly does not elevate love to the high. I mean, there are really big worldview differences that have to be negotiated in these things, and making them part of a genus, it really is misleading. I have a friend who's married to a Chinese woman, and he's done a lot of study on Chinese religions. Again, we told them they were religions, but there is no distinction at all in these Chinese traditions between what we would call philosophy and religion. Mm-hmm. Zero. They're just ways of life.
Yeah, and I mean, this would have been the case in ancient Christendom or in the Middle Ages as well among Christians. I mean, this is in a sense like the problem of the Reformation, is this issue of like, what is faith? Whereas like, a medieval Christian who went to confession when he committed mortal sin, frequented the sacraments and all of that sort of thing, it wouldn't occur to anybody to say, but do you actually believe? It's like, well, I mean, they're just living the faith. It's their faith. That's it. They're being faithful, right? And it's just a whole different way of thinking now, even among Catholics, I think.
Absolutely. And this kind of leads us up. I just follow up on that, because I think there's an important point there. And this is where I think Taylor's idea of the social imaginary is really super important. It's impossible for us to just simply approach the world, just neutrally, and look at things and call them what they are. And so we're all always, coming from somewhere, which is just the nature of being a finite creature in time and space, with a language and all those things that have been given to you in a tradition that you're always thinking out of, even if you're rebelling against it, right? So there are certain things that my students just take for granted because they're American, or they're living in America, right? That they don't think they believe it, right? They just think that, duh, it's why Jefferson says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed with it. Duh. every right thinking person, this is like a default position that right thinking people have. And as you just pointed out, that's exactly what something like going to confession would have been in maybe 1300 or something like that, right? Well, of course I go to confession because I just did this, and I'm not supposed to do that. I got to do that. I got to receive the Eucharist, and I'm not going to do that unless I do this. It would have been second nature. It would have been their social imaginary. And one of the things I try to point out in the thing that's kind of tragic is the secular social imaginary has passed it off as just being what's left over when you get rid of all the weird beliefs. And so therefore, we Christians also accept it as boilerplate, so to speak. We have the secular worldview, which is not a social imaginary for the secularist. It's just it's just kind of what's left over when you get rid of all the superstitious, or even if they're not going to put a negative spin on it, even if they would put a positive spin on it. Like, once I get rid of a Muslim's distinctly Islamic beliefs and just talk now at a purely natural level, then they're secular too. We can come to terms by getting into the secular arena, and I'll leave my Christianity behind, you leave your Islam behind. But there's no notion that actually the secular is already loaded with misconceptions about freedom, religion, et cetera, et cetera. That's what's really, I think, even Catholics they add Catholic stuff on top of the secular stuff, thinking the secular stuff is just boilerplate.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody the other day about, even things like when you go to Ave Maria or something and you see like streets named like or like the Little Flower Way, or the
Yeah.
Saint John Paul II Street, or whatever. It
Yeah.
seems like, and it's almost kind of silly, because
Yeah.
the social imaginary just seems like you can't do that with this new construction.
Yeah.
Whereas like in a place like Krakow, I mean, every single street is
Yeah.
named after a saint.
Right.
But there's nothing, I mean, you see it as almost though, okay, well, that's what they did in the past, and it's entirely normal. But yet it's in the past. I even think Polish people today, if they had like a new, I mean, I gotta go see if there's any new cities that are like coming up in Poland. But I wonder if I asked Poles if it would be silly if they, I mean, and maybe not, because they do say, okay, blessed Pope Yushko. I see that stuff all over the place.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, because I even think for like, as a growing up Catholic, you know, from southwest side of suburbs of Chicago, you're in that Catholic space. I mean, I thought when the first time I met somebody who was a Protestant, I was at my public school, and this one of a classmate of mine said she was having, church in the gym. I said, church in the gym? Because it was and then she started explaining, yeah, Protestants. And I always knew there were these little buildings around there that looked like churches, but I
Yeah.
never knew, like, and then
Yeah.
I eventually, like, the only Jewish person I knew was my doctor. And then eventually we had a Muslim neighbor. And so
Mm-hmm.
like but really this Catholic bubble,
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in. But still at the same time, it would have been weird to kind of, in some ways, mark the landscape with the faith of any
Yeah.
kind. It's felt like a voluntary thing that
Yeah.
you did, and you kept it, like you said. I mean, my whole social imaginary was just like your students, and in so many ways still is. So, I mean, I kind of wonder though, like, as Americans, what are we just trapped in this voluntaristic thing?
Yeah. It's extremely difficult to consistently get out of it. It's really, I've talked to GC Schindler about this a lot, because people immediately ask him, well, like, well, if you're against Republicans and you're against Democrats and you're against big L liberalism, what are you going to do? And it's a really frustrating question, because we aren't given many options over here outside of the liberal bubble. But one of the things he always says to me is, like, just thinking it is kind of fun. And not fun. It's liberating. It's like, aha, I got you. Like, in other words, you haven't duped me. Like, I have been outside of the cave, and now I've come back in, and I know that it's a cave, and I'm not sure what to do about that. But at least I know I'm in a cave. And I think that's actually a really helpful analogy, is thinking about Plato's cave allegory, and thinking about secularism or liberalism, or whatever we're calling it, as an instance of cave dwelling,
Hmm.
because all of us are by definition going to be born into a political order, a city, a place that is going to have just assume certain things, and certain values that are just going to be perpetuated without thinking, because we're just looking at the shadows on the wall. And it's very, very few people who are going to have imagination, the intellect, the virtue really is maybe even more important. Socrates was highly virtuous besides being just really smart. To both ascend out of that and be able to look at things maybe differently, and then have the courage to continue to think that way in the midst of the mob, so to speak, that's not going to like the fact that you're saying, hey, that tradition of speaking about freedom this way is a convention, and there's other ways of thinking about freedom that might be better than that. I mean, that's going to get you in a lot of hot water, but it also is really exhilarating, I think very liberating. And I find my students sometimes are really liberated when I tell them these things, even though they're very much in the cave. Just knowing it a little bit is like, oh, this is we're doing something bad in Hausare's class. Don't tell anyone. And I'll say like, hey, I'm the only person who's ever going to say these kind of things to you. And they're like, yeah, we know.
You're like Neo or Morpheus.
Oh dear, yeah. Just like a really old broken down version, though. Yeah.
I think that's really encouraging, Rodney. In some ways, I think you're really getting at something that Bobby and I are trying to articulate a little bit with our project. I wonder, like with regard to your students, you write in your article that this really resonated with me, that that the ones who maybe like really do come out of the cave with you, or who that really catches on, yeah. They can then sort of start to feel like pariahs. Like they can, in a way it can be liberating, and in a way it can be kind of exhilarating for a while, but then they will increasingly see themselves in contrast with the values of the world, and that can create a different kind of tension. So yes. I don't know what to do with that, but how do you interact with your students on that kind of thing?
It is hard, and that's one of the points that I make in the article. I do try to qualify to some degree. I mean, I'm a Schindler, right? So I believe that the problem begins with Locke and those guys. Like, I don't think that our founding fathers were innocent of this, and then all of a sudden we went off the rails in the 60s. However, having said that, I think that in the 60s in the United States, especially because we're always about 30 years behind Europe or something like that, the dark side of Enlightenment rationalism really started to put out its head. And it was no longer sort of the kind of humanism that a Catholic could kind of hold hands with his Protestant neighbor and his Jewish neighbor and his maybe agnostic neighbor, but at least they all believed that humans had fundamental right, the fundamental equality, things like that. Because the farther you kind of get from that Christendom, the values of Christendom and Christendom's social imaginary, the darker the social imaginary gets, so that it becomes way less humanistic. Nihilism, determinism, pessimism, we can go through all those isms, rationalism. Those are not humanistic disciplines. They're going to tell you are nothing other than a trousered ape, and social Darwinism, it's kind of fallen out of favor because it seems so mean. But it was a very, very powerful movement in the early 20th century in Europe, not just in Germany. I mean, Chesterton was encountering it in England in 1905. All of his buddies were very pessimistic, very deterministic, very, you can't know anything. There's no such thing as a self or a soul. There's no human freedom. His buddy H.G. Wells believed that. Shaw believed that. They were all reading Nietzsche. So all of a sudden, the social imaginary just gets kind of darker and darker. But what's weird in America is we still have this, we're still haunted by Christ, I think, to some degree. I mean, Flannery O'Connor says that about the South in her novels, that the South is Christ haunted. So we still do have this kind of humanism that's kind of mixed with the nihilism that makes it very hard to still point out how bleak it is. But we do see an uptick in more and more bizarre moral claims. I mean, everybody now is just for euthanasia. Just, of course, you're going to kill. You know what I mean? Abortion. As soon as you try to say something bad about it as a politician, you'll lose a bunch of votes, and then you say, "Oh, that's okay, I'm for it." So, I mean, obviously, who's going to speak up against gay marriage in public, right? I mean, it's obvious that two guys can get married, two ladies can get married. So those things obviously wouldn't have been obvious 5 minutes ago, but as this thing goes, and it seems like as it goes faster. right? Because once you kind of get the principles and they really start working and you have to see how they apply, you can just start things off the box that used to be bad now are good, and anybody who thinks they're bad is bad. And so that's, to answer your question about the pariah thing, that's the difficult thing for the students, especially. It's one thing for a professor to be a little bit of a pariah. You kind of own that a little bit, and nobody likes you anyhow, so it doesn't matter. You know, your friends. You know, you have your select friends. But for a young person between 18 and 22 to really own the Catholic difference, man, I wouldn't want to be in their shoes.
Yeah.
And when those kinds of controversial conversations come up in class, the really good Catholic kids that really do believe the faith, they head down, mouth shut. They're not eager to go down that road.
Yeah. And just to follow up by just making it clear again that you teach in a Catholic university. So this isn't like, a discussion in a setting that is not, ostensibly open to, all these different viewpoints. Right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And the only difference is that probably because I teach in a Catholic university, you're not going to get the extreme wokeism that we hear about, you know what I mean? That, what you would get in the Ivy League schools. None of our students they don't know, they've never heard of Gaza Strip. I mean, they have, but I mean, that's not really on their radar. These are first generation college kids who just want to have a better life than their parents. And so there's not a lot of ideology on my campus, but that makes it even, in a sense, stranger, because without ideology, even, it's obvious that
right.
You can take the life of an unborn child. Two dudes can get married, et cetera, et cetera. So
well, then you really,
yeah.
I mean, it seems like then you really see what the water looks like that you're all swimming in, that it isn't actually polluted by these extra kind of ideological things. And in some ways it seems much scarier then.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. All of that stuff is now very, very much a part of the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird how quickly that's happened. If you think about Hillary Clinton when she ran against Obama the first time, they asked her about the gay marriage question, and you can find her answer on YouTube, and you would be astounded how Catholic she sounds. She's literally talking. She makes a natural law argument. You're like, what is happening right here? No,
Rodney, what is it though? I mean, this is kind of maybe going to get into some of Schindler's stuff. I mean, though, like, America is such fertile soil for some of this stuff that, like 5 minutes ago, nobody would have agreed with it, a lot of this stuff. I remember in high school when the gay marriage question came up, and this was in like the mid 2000s. There was only one student, and we all saw him as kind of a radical leftist who thought it was just a good idea to think about. But like you said, I mean, knowing those students who all objected to it, nobody would even think twice about objecting to it today. But you mentioned about the Frankfurt School as well. I mean, and getting into the university, I always remember, I think it was maybe Wilhelm Reich who thought that actually his ideas were going to actually take off in America, better than anywhere else. And then you do have the sexual revolution and all of this stuff. So, I mean, why is it that America is, while you said it's maybe still Christ haunted, but at the same time, such a fertile soil for this stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the issue is, you talk about Poland and the names of the streets, and even, Europe, period, right? It's so funny, like the Italians will call themselves atheists more readily than American will, right? And Italians say, I'm an atheist, I'm a communist. They have a common party. It's kind of fun. And
I have a colleague who's like, I think, a Portuguese communist. But when we have discussions about students, he sounds more like he's defending like Catholic social teaching and what it means to be like a good father and husband. He's like very traditional.
Right.
He's a Portuguese communist.
You're right. Yeah, I mean, you let the Pope come in the streets for some kind of a festival in Rome, and all the atheists are out there, papa, 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 So there's a weird kind of memory of a pre-liberal society in Europe, because there was a pre-liberal society in Europe. We started from scratch, right? There was no pre-liberal society in the United States. So we're so used to privatizing our religion and all that stuff that this is why these things are take on so quickly, I think, and so easily, because we more than any other place have been convinced that the secular is what's left when you get rid of the esoteric. Right. So that's all you have to do to kind of win an argument about a hot button moral issue in America is just say, well, you would say that you're a Catholic, or you would say that you're a Muslim, or you would say that you're a Jew. Normal people, that is secular people, think that, X, Y, or Z is just how it is. And so my students, I think, are like, that's absolutely right. Like, I'm against gay marriage because I'm Catholic. You know what I mean? So I guess in public, we all have to be for it because public can't be Catholic, right? And so that's what starts to happen. But it's kind of interesting. What I try to do with my students sometimes to help them to see around this is just to show them that, because the secular passes itself off as kind of the obvious, kind of like, again, like this is, we're not loaded. Our position is not loaded. It's the one that just kind of comes about when you get rid of all the loaded stuff, get the loaded stuff out of the public square, and then you have ours. But it's kind of interesting, like something just like abortion, you know what I mean? So what is the magic that happens once the umbilical cord is cut that makes that that instance of human life now protected by the law? And why just 3 seconds ago is that thing not protected by the law? Mm-hmm. What's the magic that happens, right? And it really does seem like almost a mystical teaching that once they're out of the womb, you can't kill them anymore. Right. I'm like, boy, that's a piece of like mystical logic that I don't see the difference really. Show me like the science that, like I want to see empirically that there's this drastic difference between this little guy now that you've snipped the umbilical cord or something like that. Right. Or even just like the gay marriage thing. Right. So in other words, if gay marriage is a thing and it makes sense and it ought to be a thing, then the human body or the connection between marriage and having babies and things like that, all of that goes away. So there's no connection anymore between marriage and the raising of children, or natural biological children, at least. There's no connection at all between the human body and sex. They're totally divorced. You know what I mean? The body is irrelevant to sex.
I mean, I remember the student once I was teaching Catholic sexual morality. And the students, their default position on what sex is almost like contraceptive sex. It's not like connected to having children at all. Right. And it's almost like that children part is a voluntary add-on, So
right? Yeah. And so it's really what this is why I love the Chesterton quote. And this is like so important to like press this to our students too. When you get rid of the supernatural, you're not left with the natural, you're left with the unnatural, right? Because there's a sense in which the supernatural is, if you're having a traditional understanding of religio, the supernatural is impressed upon the natural, but by virtue of the fact that the natural comes from the supernatural, right? So already within the natural order, there are mysteries that point to the supernatural order, like the mystery of reproduction, which is really, I mean, you think about how this comes about. And if somebody like made up a story, like they went to Mars and like told them how like humans make babies or something, and let's say they reproduce some other weird, Martian way, they'd be like, that's a good one. Like these little sperm swimming up fallopian tube, and getting on an egg. And then all of a sudden it's a little person. They're like, that's a good one. It sounds like something out of science fiction. But we're so used to it, of course, that it now becomes totally natural to us. And we think that that's just it. But what's kind of interesting, as you keep going down the secular path, all traces of that the supernatural leaves on the natural also have to be denied. So the mystery of reproduction has to be denied. It has to be, that has nothing to do with sex. Like two guys can have sex just as well as a guy and a girl can have sex, because what does that and any of that have to do with it? It's really weird to kind of separate sex from all that stuff, but we do. Right? Because we think of it just simply as a voluntarist act that has no intrinsic meaning or purpose or telos or anything. It's just about whatever pleasure, affection, whatever. That's not really a natural position. That's an unnatural position. And that's Chesterton's point. He says, I didn't start believing in Christianity until I realized how impoverished the non-Christian worldview was. Like I couldn't be a pessimist and a nihilist and a determinist because that was just not true to reality. And he goes, I backed myself into Christianity by rejecting all these really horrible errors of modernity. And I think that's what maybe the strategy of Christianity going forward is, to show people where the logic of all these things leads, because it's not pretty. Again, Canadians are killing old people now like crazy, for all sorts of lame reasons. They're giving them lethal injections and stuff like that, and it's really ugly, because it's capitalism is going to make that really, like, oh man, it's expensive to take care of that person with the hangnail over there who's 85 years old or something. I mean, it could get pretty weird, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, Rodney, as you were talking about how, at least for a while, well, I mean, one of the issues that comes up in my mind is, both Bobby and I really like Pierre Manon's book, Beyond Radical Secularism. And, he's got this, he makes throughout that book a point that you make in your article as well, which is, it did take a while for this kind of secularism to kind of really take over. I mean, even though it sort of happened and it was official, we were still living in a kind of de facto Christian world. Yes. And that's something I think about an awful lot. And I've been thinking about it a whole lot lately. I don't know about you. I probably am just a sucker and was just completely, caught off guard. But I was actually shocked that in this year's political season, that the Republican Party just went ahead and got rid of caring about abortion, contraception. I mean, all that stuff is they just decided, nope, we're not doing that anymore. Like we're secular. We want people in our coalition who have their views or whatever. But I don't know, are things like that kind of surprising to you? Like whether it's like in politics or elsewhere?
Yeah, I was warned about this many, many years ago by Big Dave Schindler. He saw this way before most of us even had a glimpse of it, and thank God for him. But what you kind of see is that the way the debates in America are framed are rigged from the ground up to maximize individual freedom, right? Whichever party can point to the other party and say they're taking your freedom away is going to win every single debate, which is why Republicans win every gun debate and every economic debate, and why liberals win every sex debate and cultural debate, because both sides are trying to restrict freedom. Like Kamala came out the other day and said she's in favor of fracking. I want you to think about that. Right? Why does she have to be in favor of fracking? Because if she says you can't frack, she's taking away somebody's freedom to frack, right? You can't be against freedom. And that's the border stuff is all, these people are coming in to take your jobs and your freedom from you. And so everybody has to be against that. And it doesn't matter what you believe in your heart. I don't think J.D. Vance is a big fan of, come on, right? He's not an abortion fan in his private beliefs. But he has to say he is, because the party that says the most no's loses. Mm-hmm. And that's just a tragic situation we've got ourselves in, because then what you get is a downward spiral. Both parties become their worst selves. Yeah. Like when you get a bunch of Republicans who no longer care about these culture values, what do they have left? Unbridled capitalism and xenophobia. It's right.
And libertinism
like it. And again, the right to carry an assault rifle. Like what kind of a thing would that even be? Right. So you get these really preposterous caricatures of both parties at their worst, which has got to reach a point where people say, whoa, this is untenable.
And one last quick thing, and maybe to your point as well, not just who has the highest ground on the question of freedom, but also like who best manipulates the old language of the old paradigm in some ways, yes. Right? I was thinking about IVF, for example, right? So both parties are now very much in favor of IVF because both are able to say, hey, look, you people of faith are the ones who have always said we need families, we need babies, like whatever, that kind of thing, right? And so as Bobby said before, it's completely detached, I guess, from the metaphysics, right, that would have grounded these things before. They don't care. It doesn't matter.
theological language, Andrew. Remember, I mean,
Hmm.
even in the DNC, I mean, connecting it with
Hope, right?
almost yeah, hope. I mean,
Um,
it is interesting how all the like you said, everything gets replaced. It looks the same, but it's entirely different.
yeah, yeah, yep,
No, you know, I was actually going to comment a little bit on your section here with it's interesting because like so say if religio like we just can't help but giving thanks to the
yeah,
source of it all.
yeah,
And you know, you mentioned earlier like with the looking at the term like religion and even its modern usage today and contrasting that with the secular and then the colonizers bringing that to people from you know very very different civilizations and putting those
right.
categories on them. You know,
Mhm.
I recently saw a book and I haven't read it yet, but by William Kavanaugh. You mentioned Kavanaugh because he's been
Yeah,
writing on this stuff,
yeah,
and it's on idolatry. And I think you know for Christians it'd be really 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 good to think about all the kind of the social imaginary that we're in the
yeah,
context of idolatry. So like you mentioned freedom. And it's
yeah,
really interesting you said that, okay, everybody on, you know, every political party has to be for this notion of freedom.
yeah,
And then you'll win. But
yeah,
you know, some people say, oh, it's maybe capital, that's the idol of our age, or it's this, that's the idol of the age. But it seems to me that like I don't know how you'd put it, but yeah, you go going back to Locke, it is this certain notion of freedom that because
yeah.
capital just seems to enable that even that more.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's it. I mean, all of those things go together, and of course, it's interesting that we have these two parties that they seem to differ about different things, but underneath, of course, they share the same assumption. I mean, Locke is not only the founder of a really disturbing notion of freedom that's going to wreak havoc on the moral life. It's also a disturbing notion of freedom that's going to wreak havoc on the economic life and on the environment because again, it's he's always trying to find ways of divorcing one's freedom from the objective good in a particular situation. He's very much a strange kind of like moral minimalist. He
Mhm.
has this weird argument about money, for instance. Like, well, it would be greedy if Hauser took all the apples in an entire town and stored them up in his barn and didn't share them with anyone. That would obviously not be desirable. And plus, they would just go bad anyway. You know what I mean? So amassing a whole bunch of wealth to yourself and not sharing it with others is a bad thing. And that's you're like, well, Locke sounding like a church father. That's exactly what they would have said, or Aquinas would have said that, right? But then he says, so wait a second. Once you have invent money, it doesn't spoil in the barn. And so now why
Mhm.
wouldn't I amass an enormous amount of wealth to myself, even if my neighbors didn't have as much as they need, right? So the freedom to do it becomes kind of limitless, if you will. And we now live in a society where we're not really even offended or shocked anymore when we hear the obscene salaries that CEOs make, football players, college football coaches. It just that like, well, yeah, that's how it works. That's how a free society. We have to have that. Freedom makes it necessary to have these really really bad lopsided. Because what are we going to have? Socialism, So yeah, I think you're right, Bobby. It becomes kind of a fanatical, one-sided worship of a particular virtue that really does start to take on a godlike status in our thinking. Anybody who tries to limit freedom is like they're a heretic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
think, Rodney, maybe we can sort of wind down on this, like to come back to your students. Um, I mean, I think about my own children and I think about like what to hope for them, for their lives. And, I mean, I, of course, want them to have a certain amount of material success, or I want them to have, certain things. Um, and the thing that I wrestle with when I think about my children, when I think about young people today, is there's just more and more and more stuff. You talked about money before, but I mean, there are just so many more incentives than ever just to kind of go along, to get along, to continue to enjoy the stuff. But you might miss out on that if you start messing around with trying to think differently. So do you think that's part of what's going on in your students' minds and hearts?
I think so, very much. Right. So again, it's similar to them not really wanting to stand up for unpopular Catholic beliefs because it makes you a pariah and they don't want that. But then it's also, how am I going to fit into society if I teach my kids to reject certain of the unhealthy aspects of capitalism, acquisition, the consumerism and kind of all that? What's that going to look like? I mean, the guys out at New Polity are doing interesting things to try to figure this out, but there is a sense in which it's kind of, we can't all just move to Steubenville. I mean, I wouldn't want to. I've seen the color of the sky out there. It's always about gray, or something. But I think they have the most foggy days of any city in the United States, including Seattle. So that's because I was thinking maybe we could all go to the Bahamas or something. But in a more serious note, though, it is hard to do. It's very difficult for everybody to do that. I wonder, though, that one way around it, and this cannot be a long-term solution for forever, but in the meantime, in the interim, while we're living in the dark ages and storing up books for the next the next Krishna or whatever, if it isn't possible to find some niches. The modernity is ugly in a lot of ways, right? And there are these things that are making a comeback in various ways, like well-made furniture. Craft beer even is, it's become kind of capitalized and all that stuff, but still, people are like, you know what, I'm going to pay a little bit more for that beer because that guy made it the way it's supposed to be made, and he doesn't make a ton of money, but he's proud of what he does. I mean, you got these upstart craft beer guys; they're not getting rich doing it, but I think they feel really good about their product, and that's good enough. As long as they're making a living and they feel good about their product. I think there's a lot of work out there like that for people to do in our culture, because many, many people are getting burnt out on the mass-produced, cheap, stuff that America and China kick out like this. And so I think if I had kids, I would probably try to direct them to trades, things like that. I mean, maybe a college professor is still a career that you don't have to sell your soul to the devil to make a decent income, a livable income. You're not going to get rich, especially teaching theology, but things like that. I think there's hope. I would be very worried if my son wanted to go get an MBA at Georgetown. Yeah, I really would, because I think there's just a lot of just intrinsic evil. Talk about systemic evil in that world. I really do. I mean, the logic of American business is not innocent.
Yeah. Well, Rodney, keep up the good work. And, I think that message of just, maybe just in some way, finding a way, even if you're not kind of cramming Catholicism down people's throats, but just to kind of get people to see outside the cave, as you said before. I mean, even if we have to keep living in the cave, to just understand that there really is something outside. So I appreciate very much your perspective on all this.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again, Rodney, for joining us. And thanks to our listeners and viewers for tuning in. We hope that you will give us a 5-star rating, review us, share this podcast with your friends. Of course, subscribe if you have not already. And until next time, God bless and live in hope.